I'm going to spend the few minutes that I have talking about the responsibility to protect, and I'll start with a couple of reflections on why it may be a useful contribution on top of the well-worn refrain of never again, and then about what we're thinking about doing to follow up on it. I hope, although I spent 5 or 6 years now working on this issue, I hope it doesn't sound like too much of a knee-jerk bureaucratic defense. Let me start with Juan Mendez's comments at the start about the 5-part action plan and how you break down never again into manageable chunks that can be solved. He talked about preventing conflict, protecting civilian populations where it's happened, the fight against impunity, early warning and early action, and finally the readiness to take decisive action. I think one of the things we've learned in the broad agenda that I've spent the last 10 years working on, we call it the human security agenda, is that there are real problems out there that can genuinely be solved piece by piece, and we're putting in place the building blocks. Does that mean that we get it right in the first instance? Absolutely not. The critiques are entirely valid. But if we look at that agenda, on the question about the fight against impunity, we have an international criminal court now. There is actually a referral in the case of Sudan. That's a powerful shift. Is it decisive? No. But is it powerful? I would say yes. We spent 6 or 7 years working at the Security Council to get the idea of the protection of civilians embodied within the Security Council, to give peacekeepers the mandate to use force to protect civilian populations. It's now embodied in the last 7 Chapter 7 resolutions. I could go on, but I think that the argument here is it's one thing to say we fail yet again at never again, and that's true. On the other hand, the question is what are the building blocks of a strategy that will actually put it in place? And I think that references to we haven't solved the whole agenda are self-evidently true. On the other hand, let's look to some of the elements where we started to put in place the right building blocks. And let me speak very briefly then on what the responsibility to protect says, because the idea has been invoked several times. For those of you who may not be familiar with the tortuous paragraph in the World Summit, the essence of the idea is twofold. It says that states, the concept of sovereignty involves not only rights, but also responsibilities, and that the preeminent responsibility of a state is to protect its own civilian population. And secondly, it says that there is a subsidiary responsibility of the international community, and if a state fails in discharging that principal responsibility, the international community has a responsibility to intervene, including in the worst cases with military force. The international community has said that. The challenge is now to get them to act on it. Self-evidently, that's true. Just to pick up, as an aside, Mr. Kaplan's point about why we needed to do something more than just the Genocide Convention, I think you answered it yourself in your point about do we want to be involved in abstract academic debates about whether something has crossed a threshold of genocide or not. Self-evidently, no. And I think one of the really interesting things about Mr. Mendez's mandate is that although it's cast in the first instance as genocide, he's not asked to make that distinction. In fact, he's asked to explore situations where you may have crimes against humanity or other kinds of crimes that don't amount to genocide. That's an important shift. Again, decisive? No. Important? I would say yes. Let me say something then about the 3 things that we think need to most urgently be done in order to make this transition from noble words to actual action. The first is to deepen the normative consensus in the places where it matters most. And there are 2 priorities for us. The first is Africa, partly because it's the region in the world where these norms are already embodied in their security architecture. The African Union Charter actually provides for intervention by African states in cases where crimes against humanity and genocide are being committed. That's one dimension. Unfortunately, the other part of that agenda is that Africa may be the continent where these principles will need to actually be implemented. And the 2 cases that have been widely discussed here, DRC and Darfur, are obvious examples. The second region that we're putting some emphasis towards is Europe. And we're doing that because in many cases these aren't going to be peacekeeping operations. They're going to be coalitions of the willing in some form. I mean, we can think back to Timor-Leste and the intervention that was led by the Australians. There are other examples as well. And I think that we can make a credible argument that Europe will be absolutely essential if these kinds of interventions are to be mounted. Recognizing all the challenges with the post-colonial legacy, we saw a very robust intervention by the UK and Sierra Leone. We saw, although its mandate was very circumscribed, quite an effective intervention by French forces, Operation Artemis in the DRC. So again, small pieces of the puzzle, but important pieces of the puzzle. So in terms of deepening the normative consensus, Africa and Europe are a focus. A second focus is on monitoring in the field and effective political advocacy, particularly in New York, but also in P5 capitals. And this cuts directly to the mandate of Mr. Mendez, the Special Advisor on the Prevention of Genocide. We, our partners, have got the Security Council to say a lot of the right things in the last decade. There are thematic resolutions on a whole range of issues. Obviously, they've said the right thing now, finally in May, on the responsibility to protect, but they've done it on the protection of civilians, on child soldiers, on small arms, on a whole range of issues. The question is, how do you translate those thematic commitments into action? And we think the answer is to track Security Council performance, to try and hold them to account to the degree possible. That's obviously a challenge, and Mr. Mendez, who spoke to the Security Council, I believe, last week on Darfur, could speak at great length about the challenges of making that transition, but I believe that that is one of the preeminent tasks ahead of us at the moment. And then finally, and this is picking up on Kathy's point, the operational challenges of actually doing one of these kinds of interventions are worth serious reflection. I believe that one of the challenges in mobilizing political will, it's a very slippery term, we move over that very fast, and I think we really need to unpack it. One of the challenges is that we're asking political leaders to send their boys and girls to places where they may die, and that's a hard thing to ask. If they believe that those troops have been trained, if they've thought systematically about the challenges that they may actually undergo, I think the chances of them being sent are better. As I mentioned earlier, the last 7 Chapter 7 resolutions all have explicit provision for troops to use deadly force to protect civilian populations. This is already a challenge facing contemporary peacekeepers, and I fear that no matter how good the international community is in implementing a preventive agenda, we're going to face another one of these cases, and the challenge is going to be to stop it as quickly as possible. So thinking through systematically what it means to protect civilian populations through no-fly zones, through safe areas, through humanitarian corridors, through all of those challenges is something that we're promoting as well. I'll leave it at that. Obviously, those 3 things are only part of a much broader plan that other panelists have talked about to actually give true meaning to the responsibility to protect and never again, but they're the priorities we're working on at the moment. Thank you.